Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam, and on behalf of Book Soup, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's event with Achy Obejas in conversation with Luis Javier Rodriguez, here to discuss Boomerang poetry. Tonight's event will end with a Q&A, but you are welcome to ask your questions sooner. To submit a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And if you see a question on the list that you'd like for our speakers to answer, please feel free to click the like button. You can vote for your favorite question, and we will try to answer as many questions as time will allow. And please also feel free to engage with each other and the conversation in the chat area. It's, when we're virtual, it's lovely to know that you're there. So please feel free to engage that way and join us. So we'll be hosting more virtual events in the near future, and you can learn more about them on our website. You can sign up for our email newsletter. You can follow us on social media at BookSoup, and you can even follow our podcast page right here. And past events are also available on our YouTube channel. Also, please support BookSoup and our authors tonight by purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book. You can do that by clicking the green button right below the viewer screen, and it'll redirect you to our website. And if you would like to explore past books from Achy or Luis's books, we have the links in the chat area. So they're easy to find right now because no one has said anything in the chat area yet. So find that while you can, and if it gets buried, I can send it again. And with that said, I will introduce our guest for tonight. Achy Obejas is a Cuban-American writer, translator, and activist whose work focusing on personal and national identity has appeared in Prairie Schooner, Fifth Wednesday Journal, Tri-Quarterly, Another Chicago Magazine, and many other publications. A native of Havana, she currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. And, oh, sorry, Kathy, here, one moment. Hopefully that won't happen now. Okay, and I will unmute them in a moment. Luis Javier Rodriguez is a poet, novelist, journalist, critic, and columnist. He was the 2014 Los Angeles Poet Laureate, and Rodriguez is recognized as a major figure in contemporary Chicano literature. We are very excited to have you both with us tonight. It is a true honor to meet you both and have you here with us. So everyone, please enjoy and sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm particularly honored. He's an old friend.
Oh yeah, we have long history.
Go way back, and it's really great that her literary life, your literary life, is very strong, and it should be strong. I know you're a multi-genre writer, which I'm very interested about because I like to talk about how poets do multi-genre work. We have history that even we didn't even know we had because I started as a journalist in the San Bernardino Sun in 1980, and I was actually blacklisted from newspapers because of the editor. And I don't want to mention his name now, but I wrote about it, who blacklisted me from working in any daily newspaper in the area because he accused me of being a communist advocate, which is like the worst things you could be in journalism. You know how that goes. And I've had that all my life with people who didn't like my politics or were concerned about this and that. Didn't matter. I keep doing what I'm doing just like you. And so I don't know if you knew that story. I was actually got out of the business, but then I started working as my own freelance writer, but then radio, news radio. In Chicago, I was working in news radio.
Right.
So it didn't take me away. But what I think what's important is the friendship we had in Chicago. We had many years there. I had many years there, 15 years there. That's your life. But I always appreciated your graciousness, your openness, you were never an ego-driven person. You know what I'm saying? You have this expansiveness about you. And I want to mention that because to me that's powerful. It shows in your poetry. I read Boomerang. It's just so there. So much of you giving, your generosity, the spirit in your heart, but also the generosity of your mind. And we can talk more about that, but I want to maybe turn it over to you because I'm sure you want to say a few words, maybe read a poem before we get into some questions and see if we can get this going. Thank you again for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. When Beacon reached out to me and said, "Who do you want to be your conversants on this?" You were like probably the first name that came out of my mouth. So it was really nice that we could pull it off. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. I remember once sitting in my living room and going over a manuscript that you were thinking about translating for Tia Chucha, and I think we talked for like 3 hours about language and translating, and I think only like Jeannie calling it made it so that you had to go home, because we could have just kept going and going and going. So I'm happy about that. Anyway, I wanted to start tonight with one of the poems from the book, and this one, it's called Slow. The clock of the long now will operate knowing it will lose the correct time, exposed as it will be to imprecise temperatures, stellar and solar alignments, tectonic movements, orbital dynamics, and the fallacies of the human hands that must keep winding it by turning a crank or pulling a chain. In the German village of Halberstadt, at the end of the 20th century, a trust of theologians, composers, and musicians gathered to discuss the 649-year history of the organ, what Mozart called the king of instruments. 3 centuries earlier, in that same village, a court Jew had defied the authorities by printing 2,000 copies of the 12-volume Babylonian Talmud as a gift to the poor. The Talmud, which runs almost 3,000 pages, can weigh about 30 pounds. That same court Jew had also built a synagogue, Baroque in style and said to be quite beautiful, that stood for more than 300 years until it was demolished in 1938 after Kristallnacht, and from which rose an aircraft factory a few years later, manned by slaves, transported from Buchenwald. In that same village, there's a church without a basilica, centuries old, bare, and rugged, and abandoned, a former monastery and pigsty constructed out of harsh, cold stone. The theologians, composers, and musicians built an organ there that kicked off its only concert with a 17-month rest. Its first note came later, like an air raid siren, and played for months and months, heaving and exhaling, crackling and burning. Now, every few years, the villagers, descendants of the court Jew, those who devastated the synagogue and worked in the factory and at Buchenwald, come and rearrange the 30-pound sandbags that weigh down the organ's pedals. There's a whir and a note is added, and the court changes. Pipes are installed as needed. Each movement will last a lifetime. The clock of the long now will tick once a year. The century hand, which corresponds to the hour hand on a typical timepiece, will move every 100 years. Using the Daf cycle of a page a day, it takes more than 7 years to read the Talmud, though enlightenment is a different matter. On the planet Venus, a day lasts longer than a year. Here on Earth, blue whales come to the ocean surface mostly at night, their hearts pumping a turpid 4 to 8 beats a minute. Their songs are composed of a handful of notes, but we usually hear only about half of them, the tones dropping into frequencies too low, too deep for us. I'm telling you this because time is a ruined fountain, a prayer to the sea, a head-first dive into stillness. I am telling you this because the universe is at absolute zero until I rise naked to the surface, night or day, and you are there.
That's beautiful. I'm going to do something here because I understand there may be some feedback issues. I'm going to turn off the air conditioning behind me, just in case it's that. Let me do this real quick.
Okay, we'll do that.
That may not be the problem. Anyway, here it is. Let me just say how central the poetry is in this book, and that poem in particular, but almost all your poems. You're talking about some very important topics. The one topic that really touched me a lot, maybe I say something about it, the exile. what it means, how it feels, why it even exists, and how it exists for you. I think that's one of the key things that I found from Boomerang, because I think people really understand it, how you can feel exile, how even when you're in your own country, in your own city, you're in exile, how not being able to belong is a big problem. In our culture and in our world, we're losing our sense of belonging. There's so many refugees, and all of us are refugees of something to the other now. And maybe you can speak to that, because I saw that as a very powerful part of what you were trying to say in Boomerang. I want to explore that if you can speak on it.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a family of exiles. My parents were exiles from Cuba. Technically, I am too. I was born in Cuba, and we came over post the revolution of 1959, and we escaped in the middle of the night in a little boat. And one of the things that always struck me about exile versus just what we think of as immigration is the notion that you couldn't go back. You're forced away from your home country because of political conditions that are not of your desire and that put your life in danger in some way. And my dad had been working for the counter-revolution, so there was no question that his life was in danger, and which is why we left. But I think the things that always struck me about the not being able to go back were, many things, but among two of the most important, I think. One was that you could not only reinvent your life for real, in the sense that here you are in this other country and you have to become something else because you're no longer what you were in your life, but you could also reinvent your past because nobody could check it. And so I think in the case of a lot of Cuban exiles, they looked back on their life with this idea that they were something else, or they presented themselves in this country where they were looked down on as more than they really were, back home. My mom had a joke about how, all the maps that made Cuba look, like a small island were wrong, because if you actually counted all the land that all the Cubans in the United States claimed to own, Cuba was actually about the size of Texas, because everybody apparently had been a landowner at one point. And so it was sort of curious for me to, my dad in particular really had a kind of a very imaginative sense of who he had been, and who his family had been. I mean, for example, my grandfather was the mayor of a little town on the eastern side of the island called Higuera. And, my dad always made it sound like he was like Richard J. Daley, I mean, just this puppet master, this political, mastermind. And, when I finally get to Higuera, I realize it's a fishing village of about 1,700 people. And when I look in the historical archives in town just to get information, about, my family and stuff, I discovered my grandfather was actually the puppet of the United Fruit Company, and had been their candidate for years and years and years. So that's one thing, that you can distort, you can purposely distort, and perhaps even eventually believe your purposeful distortion. But also this sense of not being able to go back and maybe not really belonging, it feels like, I think sometimes feels like a jail cell, because you can't hold out the possibility of return, I mean, my dad was such a strange creature in Michigan City, Indiana, where I grew up. I mean, he had an accent, he wore a beret, for God's sake. He looked like a character, I think. And for him, he got up in the morning and he put on his suit and he dropped that beret on his head, and he thought he looked great, un profesional, rumbo a su trabajo. But in fact, people were like, who is this guy? And that notion of return being impossible and then having to fit by force, I think, it is is a really defining aspect of the thing. Although I also think that there are other kinds of exile, even if you can legally return. I think that what you're returning to is never what you think you're going to return to anyway. So I think a lot of times immigrants are much more in exile than they realize until they attempt return, and then they go, oh God, no, this is not what I left. This is not what I have been dreaming of for so many years. This is
Have the country that you imagine.
yeah, it's another country.
And you know, just to make some parallels, my father was similarly exiled politically because he was actually a leftist. And even though it seems left in the world, is actually right wing. There's a lot of fascism in Mexico, as you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, very strong wing. So he was in prison. And he was an educated man. He was a high school principal, but they would refuse to give him money for the school. So he went and sold the iron fence to get supplies for the kids, and they got him for stealing property, and they put him in jail. This, I think, what drove him like, I need to come to the United States. But I mentioned that because, again, the problem is we can never really go back. My mom always had to know, she won't go back and get buried in Mexico. She never did. She's buried here in East LA, you know. And she never learned English, and that doesn't happen all the time. My mom never learned English. My dad never learned English. Neither one of them. They spoke Spanish for 50 years in this country. I just mentioned all that because, again, as a child of parents like that, we have to imagine what that world is. And I'll tell you a funny story. I was 11 years old when we went back to Ciudad Mexican border people. We went back there, and I thought I spoke perfect Spanish because I grew up speaking Spanish all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They made fun of us. I couldn't understand. Why are they making fun of us? We didn't belong anymore in Mexico. Now we were what we used to call potros. Now like, you don't speak good Spanish. What's wrong with you? And I was totally like, I didn't understand. I thought we were speaking Spanish. We weren't speaking the language anymore.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I think Spanish is a real like dividing line for a lot of people. You know, my dad sort of refused to believe in his exile. You know, he wanted very much to think that there was a possibility of return, even though God knows it. I mean, it obviously didn't happen. And so he was an absolute language tyrant. He made us speak Spanish at home all the time. And I had a similar experience when I went back to Cuba for the first time, because I understood everything, and I had enough of a vocabulary to be able to respond to everything, but my cadence was completely different. And it was, I didn't have an accent, but I had, and you probably had the same problem because you don't have an accent either, but you probably have a cadence issue. And it actually took a lot of work. I ended up living in Cuba for a little bit, and I had a very intense and intimate relationship with Cuba for about a decade and a half, to sort of find the right cadence and become comfortable in it. And also to pick up a lot of the contemporary, vernacular, because the thing about language, as you well know, is that it's never static, right? It always evolves and moves and stuff like that. And the slang of, the 1960s and the 70s is very different than the slang of the 21st century. In fact, one of the things that I was so amused by when I went back to Cuba was finding so many people who claimed to speak English, and they did, but they spoke English as if they were fixed in 1956. Yeah. They were saying swell,
like
and
the cards.
Yeah, the markers were really really different, and that was really a huge sort of surprise to find that Cuba was often seen as being in a time warp because of the cars and stuff like that. But a lot of the English that's spoken there is also in a time warp, and that was sort of funny. And the other thing that was interesting to me was also understanding that Cuba evolved in some ways that, like, my parents never caught up with. I remember after Days of Awe came out, I went to Miami for a series of readings, and one of the readings was at a conference about Cuba or something. And there was a panel, and one of the guys on the panel was saying, you know, for me, you know, I left in 1980 when things were this way and this way and this way and this way, and now things are this other way. And my dad was like, I do not recognize the Cuba he's talking about. Not the now, not the 1980. I have no idea what he's talking about. And I mean, that everything is really, our memories are based on things that are so fleeting, so very, you know, they're just like soap suds or something. They just don't stick. They don't stay.
Yeah, and one of the things that happened with Mexicans is that there's a third culture. We call it Chicano. Some people don't use that term, but it's not Mexican, it's not American. People say, well, you're Americanized. We weren't Americanized. We weren't. We weren't becoming anglicized. Some people are, but that's not what the Chicano was. The whole Cholo culture was street culture that came out of here. You know what I'm saying? Everything came out of Mexico. You know, Cholo stuff is really big in Central America. It's big in El Salvador, but they got it from LA and they got deported. They deported that culture. And so we created a third culture because we couldn't fit in Mexico anymore. We couldn't fit in America. You know what I'm saying? And it's very large, very extensive. The neighborhoods I grew up in were so clearly Chicanoized. You know, they knew they were Chicano. They spoke English. They did it. They had a whole different culture, and it was very powerful. And I find people gravitated more to that coming from other countries than they did to the American culture or even the Mexican Paisa culture, you know, from Mexico. They gravitate, you know, like all the Blood and Crips kind of Chicanoized Americans, Cambodians from the killing fields became Cholos in their own way, Salvadorians, you know, coming out of the civil wars and all the pain that they went through, come in here and their trauma met the trauma of the Chicano inner city and they became Cholos. You know what I'm saying? In other words,
oh yeah,
their culture really impact people. But what I wanted to ask you though has more to do with language, because one of the things I had to do is I had to dominate English. I never forgot my Spanish. I still speak Spanish, and my mom and dad also spoke Spanish, even though, like you're right, in Mexico, it's a different cadence and stuff. I get along okay in Mexico now, years and years of going back and forth. But I really wanted to dominate English. It was my revenge against this country, bad aspects of the country, you know what I'm saying? Because English was a language I didn't dominate. They made fun of me. I couldn't get it right. And I went back to school and I wanted to learn. Your English, obviously, and your Spanish is very powerful. And when you get to poetry, you're talking about another level or layer of language creation. That's very powerful. So I wanted to see, to hear more about how you do that. How do you go from the language that's higher level poetry, where you do, but also to connect it with the Spanish, where you do?
That's such a good question. You know, I think that's a much more deliberate event than just being bilingual. You know, when I started doing translation, I had to think about language in a completely different way. And because when you're doing translation, you're not just going for meaning, you're also trying so hard, so much to capture that person's voice, the person you're translating. And so, you know, like when I was translating Junot Diaz, there was a very strong sense of needing to get this kind of Black inflection in his Spanish because his English has an Afro-American inflection. And, you know, to just translate him straight out would be a complete betrayal to literally the voice, the sound of his words, and the way that the images formulate by virtue also of that sound, you know? And so a lot of times when I'm, for myself, for example, when if I'm working something of mine from, let's say, Spanish to English, one of the things that I try to do is to use like Latin-based verbs, for example, rather than a verb that might have some other root, because it's more likely to have some evocation of Spanish underneath it somewhere, maybe, create a rhythm more similar to the Spanish, to, sometimes the vowel sounds will repeat in some ways that help sort of give that essence. So it's such a deliberate act. It's not just the music sitting on my shoulder and I am dancing the tango. I mean, it's a really, intense choreography between the sound, the meaning, the voice of the person you're trying to capture. It's also always tricky when you're doing yourself, because, you think you sound like something, but somebody may hear you in a very different way. So you need to, I always check with, I always give my stuff, besides reading it aloud constantly, and I'm sure you do this too. I always have, readers who will look at it. And if I'm going into Spanish, to be perfectly honest, I have readers look at it because I, like you, have no formal education in Spanish.
Yeah.
So though I am at this point in time pretty confident in a lot of ways about my Spanish, my written Spanish, I still know that there are things I'm going to miss because I just don't have that training. I read a lot in Spanish these days because I want that to be better. I'm such a nerd about language, but I know that, I always, hey, how do you, punctuate this if I'm doing this, and you also begin to integrate that stuff too as you learn it, right? Like, a stupid nerd example, but like the comma, the use of the comma. In English, it's got a very specific purpose. It's a pause, period, and paragraph. It's not a full stop. In Spanish, that comma is really flexible. It can be a stop. It can be, a little, it can be a half a stop, a 3/4 stop. It can be a hail my mom. It's a very, very flexible little piece of grammar. And so, if I originate something in English and I'm trying to go into Spanish, the tendency is to punctuate it like it is in English. But in Spanish, that may sound really choppy.
Yeah, that's exactly
so.
Right.
Yeah, so you have to sort of keep reading it until you find the way into it. And then, oh, yeah, it's one of those little funky comments.
I hope people can appreciate what this has to do with your work, because your work is very rich. But there is extra work that you have to do when you have to think about these things that other people may not have to think about. Not just the language in English as you understand it. Clarity, to me, is very key for you. Clarity is important for any art. It doesn't mean you have to understand every line. You still get to be clear about what you're saying and why. But also in the Spanish, and I'm lucky that Queenie is a perfect Spanish speaker. She actually interpreted for the courts in Chicago, a high-end level interpreter for the court. So she's my first interpreter.
Yeah, you need somebody like that.
You need
that. I always go to her because she grew up in Cuba. Her education's in Cuba, and I'm like, keep it up, please.
Because, but the other thing I want to talk about is there's two other aspects of art and poetry. One is gravitas, gravity in the sense of the weight, the substance. And you have a lot of that, and that's important because I read a lot of poetry, and believe it or not, I think a lot of gravitas is trying to go away. I may be wrong, and maybe I'm reading it all wrong, and then I see it pop up in new works here and there. But I really love that the substance that we talk about has depth, and that's important because all your poems, to me, had a grounding that was very deep, and that's an important part of the work, as well as the integrity, which I think it was James Joyce, who said it was the proper relation of the parts to the whole. So your book hangs very well. There's so many parts. There's moving parts to it. There's parts that, but it's the integrity of it is very strong. So I want you to talk about that, the gravitas end of it, but also the integrity of the work.
Well, the book came together in a kind of an interesting way, really. I have a friend, Lawrence Schimmel, who is a wonderful author and a terrific editor. And in fact, the book is dedicated to him. He does a lot of different kinds of work. And for a long time, he was writing a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. He lives in Spain. He's fully bilingual, and he would come to the States for this annual sci-fi conference. The conference was in Madison, Wisconsin, but he'd stay with me in Chicago. And every year he'd try to get me to show him my poetry, which was really pretty private. I mean, in Chicago, I very rarely did poetry readings. And when I did, it was it was always with somebody else, because I really just didn't feel like I had a lot of public material. I usually just read prose. And so finally one year I just handed him all my spiral notebooks. I mean, literally like in high school. And he came back with basically a manuscript for a chapbook, which is what ended up getting published as This Is What Happened in Our Other Life. And that did really well in ways that were completely unexpected to me. It got great critical response, and it sold really well. And I was sort of stunned by that. And whenever I would go to writing conferences, people would ask me, when are you going to do another poetry book? Or are you going to do a poetry book since you did this chapbook? And, I really thought that was a one-off, but I started thinking more and more about it. But I wanted to construct it. I didn't want to just go through my stuff and go, oh, this one's good, and this one's good, and this one's good, and I like this one. Oh, no, not that one. I wanted to really think about what I wanted to be in it. And I spent almost 2 years putting it together, thinking about what should be in it, what shouldn't be in it, what were the themes I wanted to hit. And then in the last year, I made the decision to try to write it completely gender-free, which was not that hard for the English because I write a lot in second person, but it was a real challenge for the Spanish because the Spanish is a very binary language. Every single object, every single noun has a gender. And it doesn't always make sense. I mean, el problema. Yeah. But, okay. Yeah, but just some stuff the Spanish word for dick, right? Polla. Why is it la polla? Mm-hmm. Clitoris. Why is it el clitoris? It doesn't make any sense. Why is the table feminine? Why is the car masculine, but the bus, if you say it in Cuban style, guagua, it's feminine. So it does. I mean, and the way inclusive language was playing out in Spanish, it's very person directed. It's like it takes the binary out of people, right? But all objects remain within the binary. And that to me is even more useless than the binary on people, right? Because some people, as I started to write, I realized some people really do live in the binary and should not be degendered because their life experiences, their situation, whatever it might be, is within the gender. Like, I cannot write about my mother as a degendered human being because she was a person who was very much of her time and of her gender. I have a poem in the book that references Hemingway. I cannot fathom Hemingway as degendered because he was toxically masculine in a way that is part of who he was both as a person and as a writer. Yeah. So I want him to be gendered. On the other hand, there are people who, very much need to be degendered. There's nothing particularly gender specific, but the table really shouldn't be gendered. There is nothing about the table that's gendered. So I basically took Spanish and completely rewrote the rules on gender, left it, used a different ending, used an E instead of an A and an O. And that was kind of fun. What was interesting was that when I proposed it to Beacon, we were already deep into this, and I proposed it to Beacon, and they were like, sure, what does that mean? You know, I mean,
Forget
they were great. They were fantastic, but it was I could tell that they glazed right over when I said that. You know,
big issue even now politically with Latinx or Latinx, and I know the whole debates and everything. But like you're saying, language is enriched all the time. And
oh yeah,
this new consciousness that we're in, this new awareness, has to be folded into the language somehow. And I think what you're doing is really important, and that's what we should do with it. I think that's what poets should do all the time. Reimagine, reinvent it, remake it what it needs to be, for whatever we're dealing with. So.
yeah. I'm really curious what the critics are going to do with it, and of course the academics. God knows the academics. They're
in the Spanish language
stuff. Yeah.
They're like the Royal Society of Spain.
Oh yeah, no, they're not going to do anything with it.
They translated my book, Always Running in the Border Spanish.
Oh yeah.
Med Paso, who understood the language of fronterizo. It's not quite what people can imagine, and it's funny because it's really hard to read if you're from Spain or other countries, even other parts of Mexico.
Right.
Salvadorians loved it. My book, I was able to get to El Salvador and Guatemala. I brought my book because they can distribute them there. But
those are small countries. They're within spitting distances of so many borders that they practically live on a border.
They get the whole idea of how language can be.
Absolutely.
And so I think what you're doing is very powerful. What I wanted to explore then is a little bit about what you were saying about the integrity of the book. Because I think the book holds very well. It's really hard to go with all these different things and have a relationship between all the parts. You did a very good job. As you know, I published the Achucha Press. I'm the founding editor. I've done many, many books.
Yeah, that's about.
Yeah, I'm looking for people that manuscripts can actually hold together. They can go all kinds of ways, but you need to make sure that it's not just a mishmash of, I want to know how it holds. See what I'm saying? So Bumerang holds very well. And how was that process for you? Because again, you're talking about love, you're talking about exile, you're talking about your family, you're talking about all kinds of issues that still have a connection. You know what I mean? Still are tied in with you. How was that, or even if it was a process, maybe it just happened naturally?
Well, I mean, I tried to figure out how I wanted to, what I wanted to talk about. I mean, I have poems about, all sorts of stuff. And so, but I realized I had these like three main sort of constant concerns, Cuba in one way or another, immigration and all the things attached to that. And of course, lots of stuff around relationships and love and all this stuff. But in the last few years, a lot of my physical and social activism had changed dramatically because I had kids, and I can take them to some stuff, but not all. And so I was thinking, a lot of the energy that would have been going into, putting these things together and getting arrested and going to town hall meetings and all this stuff was more about educating myself and about, thinking and reflecting. And so a lot of poetry came in the last few years about issues that normally I wouldn't have necessarily put down on paper or in quite that way. And I thought also those were some of the more important and powerful pieces in the book. I feel like I became a student in a way again of certain things. I remember going to the Black Panther exhibit at the Oakland Museum, and I knew so much of that stuff already, but sitting there with it was a very different ball game. And I was lucky. One of the trips that I made was with Helen Schiller, who as the former 46th Ward alderman from Chicago, who's not African American, but who was very much a part of the early Black Panthers. And she was in the exhibit, and she was part of the exhibit. And realizing that I had this source, this prima source with me, it also just enhanced my knowledge, my ability to sort of get through and beyond just what was there. But and talking about it, I mean, I remember we went home and she was visiting obviously for the exhibit, but she was staying with me, and I think we talked about it for like 3 days straight. So I got saturated, and my head was spinning in ways that were so good and so important. And so I was able to like come back with some of that, but not in a, I don't like being like, I dread the pamphlet, the pamphlet poem. I dread that. And that might also be because I'm Cuban, and there's so much horrible pamphlet poetry comes from Cuba. And I want it to be real. I want it to be felt. I want it to be like flesh and blood and stuff that's about ideas, not about the Black Panthers. I want it to be about the ideas that they had, and that was the great thing about having Helen here, that we could sit here and talk about why and how and the conditions that created these things. And then drawing connections with, the disability movement, and drawing connections with, the LGBTQ movement and things like that. So it was really cool.
So, I'm going to let the audience know that if anybody has any questions, you can put a question in there and we'll try to get questions to you. But I was wondering if you wanted to share another poem.
Sure. I'm happy to. Actually, why don't I read that one? I'll read the march.
Mm-hmm.
I'm about to step outside. I'm about to step outside to the elements, and my anticipation is a long inhalation. It covers the world upon release. This is the beginning of a movement based on facts and not on sentiment or pronouncements. Though both sentiment and pronouncements are useful and worthy. As I begin to lift my left foot, my sartorius muscle allows my knee to move up towards my body. I am joined by others, however they can join me, others who have suffered and are not afraid to continue suffering. What we seek is a new majority rooted in justice for all, whose conscience is committed to seizing wrongs and doing right. What we want is nothing about us without us. What we want is for each individual to define their own identity and expect that society will respect them. We shift our weight, unlock our knees, arrange our bodies in the best way for each of us. For an instant, most of us are standing on one foot. We are not in a hurry. We are not dreaming. We are ready to give up everything, even our lives. We shall do it without violence, because that is our conviction. What we want is freedom. What we want is the power to determine our destiny. As my left foot comes down, it is coordinated with my right, and they match the equivalent movement of those who have joined me and with whom I am joining. We are firmly rooted. Whenever possible, we let our limbs swing in a natural motion and keep our heads facing forward. What we want is the complete elimination of military forces, not just from this or that territory, but from every corner, every outpost on Earth. What we want is full and meaningful employment. What we want is decent, safe housing. What we want is an education that teaches us our true histories and their consequences on the present. As each of us lifts our right foot or makes the equivalent movement to ambulate, we are now a perfectly synchronized force, even in our differences and occasional disorder. What we want is an immediate stop to state brutality and the assassination of Black people and Native people and disabled people and queer people and trans people and women and children and mothers and fathers who can only do so much because they are shackled by the very state that seeks to kill them for having foolishly believed they were free. What we want are the doors flung open to Folsom, Rikers, Guantanamo, San Quentin, San Juan de Lurigancho, ADX Florence Supermax, La Sabaneta, Attica, Camp 22, Holsmore. It would be fatal to overlook the urgency of the moment. As we advance, we're a thunderous thrum. Some of us will run under the rain in Seattle and toward traffic to block Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. Others will flood Wall Street and more will storm the Port of Oakland. There will be one lonely soul in snowy Bethel, Alaska, and clusters in Little Rock, in sweltering Ferguson, and Tallahassee, and Flagstaff, Baltimore, Detroit, Honolulu, Boise, in ancient Salem, Wichita, and Northampton, Oklahoma City, and Spearfish, South Dakota. Nerve and muscle adapt to the rhythmic stimulus of our own noise, the noise we make together. It is true that when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one person to connect to another and another and another in order to defend our equality, our difference, our dependence on one another, then.
When I read that poem, I think of all the marches I've been on, and I've never read a poem that covered it so well. Because I think what you're saying is true. It's not a passive poem. It's a poem of movement. It has so much movement in it. It covers so much ground. And then it makes you think, well, mythical, imaginative things with that poem. And that's what I think is powerful. That's what makes it work. It's the work that I appreciate of the best of Pablo Neruda or Gabriela Mistral or Rocky Dalton, anybody that was trying to do what you're trying to do and still keep it poetry. You know what I'm saying? Still keep it. Now, what I love about your work, the breath movement. I can feel how your breath is into the poems, how they help with the sentiment. You know, as you're reading, I feel the breath. And I think that really makes it powerful in an artistry that a lot of people don't think about. I always try to tell young people, this is why I appreciate when you say you read your poems out loud, whether it's English or English, you have to, because that breath helps with the line breaks, why you do this, why you don't do this, how you read it. Breath is so vital to poetry. And so anyway, that's what makes that poem so good.
Well, what I love about the poem is that I was able to get a lot of the language of the Black Panthers' 10-point manifesto right in the poem and integrate it with language from other political treatises that are important to me. I mean, the absolute dominant document is the Black Panthers' 10-point plan, but it's so interesting because when you read it, it doesn't read like a poem. It reads very much like a political manifesto. So it was interesting to try to figure out how to mount it. And then I realized, well, the very movement actually that we take for granted as we march, we take so much for granted. We don't think, well, I'm lifting my foot or I'm moving in this way. We're all moving together, and yet those things are happening in this very organic and natural way all the time. So that it was really it was such a joy to write that one and also to share it with Helen right away. That was really good. That was one of the best parts of writing that piece, to have her light up like, oh man, that was my art.
Your reading was very powerful. I wanted to say that I also came out of movements. I remember when I was 16, I was involved in the Chicano moratorium. But my issue was that I was arrested, held for several days. Everybody got arrested, 300 people, all of them were people within a few hours. 5 of us cholos were held for several days in Murder's Row. They put us in cell. I had a cell right next to Charles Manson because they wanted to charge us for the murder of people that died during the Chicano moratorium, which would have happened if it wasn't for the fact that at the time, for the first time maybe, or maybe one of the few times, people were documenting with Super 8 film, it wasn't video, what was going on. It was these revolutionary radical photographers and people that just, and
Thank God they were there.
Exactly. All they showed was the police beating and killing people, including Ruben Salazar. So they eventually had to let me go. They came in the middle of the night After several days and nights stuck there, they were going to charge you for the murders because you guys started the riot, all this kind of stuff. And I'm there in murders where all these murders playing cards. And I started my first poems there. I started writing my first poems. They didn't. They awoke something to me that may not have happened if I hadn't gone through it. And of course, they woke me up, threw me out, and no charges, but the damage had been done. So I think about that because I think that was my first major march. And again, I got hundreds of marches. I get that rhythm that you get into and what it means and what it means for the world. So I know we're almost getting to the end, but I want to say what I found in your poetry is an immense amount of beauty, which I think is important. I mean, there's beauty, and it takes mastery of language, mastery of thought, and the mastery. I can see the mastery, and I want to let you know. I'm not. Who am I, the big judge? I don't know. I just love poetry. I've always loved poetry, and I've written so many poems. And I want to say that the beauty is very strong. I also see a struggle, and it's a struggle nowadays for truth. It's important. Poetry is struggling against a world in which everything's a lie. You know what I'm saying? This whole world, everything's lying. Newspapers lie. Everybody, we're living in a world in which now nobody knows what the truth is, but the truth is there. And poetry is one place where you can't help but be truthful. And so you're in that world, that truth, the truth, whatever truth that needs to come out. And the last thing I just want to say that I find.
Actually, Luis, wait, we have a question actually from somebody in the audience. She asks, are the Spanish poems translations of the English or vice versa, or are they independent?
That's a good question.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I chose to do in this piece was in this book, is not to indicate which is the original and which is not. I write more in English than I do in Spanish, but I do write in both. And I think you can make an educated guess that most of the poems are originally in English, and some of them have been published in English. But the reason I did that is because I think there's an obsession with this notion of what's the original, and the obsession with what's the original ends up taking away from the rendition in the second language. And I didn't want to have that conversation. I think it's the reason I didn't want to have that conversation because I think it doesn't matter. I think what matters is the words on the page. And what came first? It's kind of a chicken or the egg question. I always think it's sort of a trick question. There's no way to really justify your translation of something if somebody wants to nitpick about a word or something. And also, languages lend themselves in different ways to different things. Right now, I'm translating lyrics for Rosalia, the flamenco hip hop singer. And, she uses all these flamenco terms that have no translation whatsoever. When she says, I'm Honda, it's like, that's it. That's what it is. End of story, and it sounds beautiful in Spanish. And my choices in English are like, do I footnote this or do I find something else? I'm thinking, who comes to Rosalia to listen, to care about her music, already knows this, knows that she's a flamenco hip hop singer, and might already be familiar with these terms or might be willing to look these up. So I'm going to leave them alone, but somebody else might have a bitch with me about that as a translator. And I just want each of these versions to stand on their own, to just be their own thing.
Here's what I would add, when I do Spanish, it's got to have its own artistry.
Right.
Just do a translation. The Spanish might take me to other areas that I let go because it has to take me there. So I do direct translations. I know there's people that do that, but when it comes to my poetry, it's like I can't do direct translations. I let the poem go. And I noticed that with good translators, like Miguel de Unamuno has this famous poem that Robert Bly translated. Robert Bly poem, they really aren't the same poem. very powerful. You know what I'm saying? The translation itself is powerful. It's another poem, basically, of the translation of this. But if you put them next together, you realize they're not really a direct translation, but they don't have to be. There's another poem there. I hope that.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I really appreciated what that meant to how they had to stand alone was reading a bilingual version of Borges's The Gold of the Tigers, a translation that he did himself. And so,
Another.
and he was a master. He was fluent in both languages. He wasn't struggling to figure out how to say anything in English. He spoke English with a beautiful British accent, and was incredibly erudite. And the poems vary because languages do different things. I mean, he has a line in one of the poems in Spanish which is great. It's "Me duele una mujer." Okay, there is no way in hell you can say that in English. Okay, I mean, it literally means a woman hurts me, but that sounds like the woman is like beating you up, right? and what he means is, I have this incredible ache in my soul because of this woman, and so it's going to vary. It isn't this. I have a terrible ache in my soul isn't the same thing as me duele una mujer.
It's
the closest I can get to it,
That's right. So I think it's very powerful, and I'm glad that question came in. We're getting close to the end. I just want to express my gratitude. I think you and me can talk for another hour, like we did before. And I want to say again, your friendship means a lot to me. I don't really see you. I follow what's happening with you. I followed some of your books. I think I have some here. Please, anybody, come to Theatre Center Cultural Bookstore, which I started 20 years ago. I want to see if we can get Achy there, even if it's virtual. We have a beautiful space that we just moved into, 3 times bigger than the previous space. I'm just mentioning that because part of what I do is to create space like that will help others. So Achy, I'm inviting you to we'll work on that.
We'll make it work.
And I want to see if you have anything you want to end with, or anything you want to say at the very end here.
Yeah. Well, just thank you for doing this, and thanks for the chat. Thanks for the reunion.
Yeah.
And thank you to Book Soup for having us. Great place in LA. I think it's like my 3rd reading with Book Soup.
Yeah, they've been good.
And thank you to absolutely everyone who gave us part of their Friday evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to end there. Love you all. And let's get together sometime. We'll figure it out.
We will. Hi to Trini.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Achy and Luis. That was a beautiful conversation. Just so everyone knows, you can share this and rewatch it at any time. So if you want to share it with any friends who didn't get to make it, or any poets in your life, that would be amazing. And just going to encourage you one more time to buy Boomerang if you have not already, or any of the books from the links on the slide. And remember to keep supporting independent bookstores. And also, thank you. I second Achy's statement of thank you for sharing a piece of your Friday, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your weekend. Good night.